The bar smelled like rain and engine oil, and the kind of silence that collects in a room full of men who have stopped talking. Hank Driscoll sat in the corner booth with a glass he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. The television above the bar was playing something no one was watching. The pool table in the back had gone quiet 10 minutes ago when the last game ended and nobody racked a new one. It was the kind of autumn evening that made people settle into themselves, and the Ironside Bar and Grill had settled into its own particular version of stillness, the low hum of a room that was occupied but not animated. He was looking at his phone, not at a message or a notification, but at a photograph he kept in a folder he never opened except on nights like this, when the rain and the season and the hour conspired to put him in a certain kind of mood. The photograph was 11 years old. In it, a girl of 17 stood on the front porch of a house that no longer existed, wearing a denim jacket and a silver ring on a chain around her neck. She was laughing at something outside the frame. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and the light behind her was the gold of late summer. Sharon. He closed the phone and set it face down on the table. Outside, the drizzle had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and the bar windows were streaked with it, turning the parking lot lights into soft orange smears against the glass. His men were scattered through the room in the way they always were on quiet nights. Jake at the bar, nursing a beer, Connor on a stool near the door. With his back to the wall, Tyler behind the counter drying glasses with a towel that had seen better decades, Garrett at the far end reading a newspaper he'd already read twice. The Ironside sat at the edge of the valley, a squat brick building with a painted eagle on the sign out front, its wings spread wide across weathered wood. The eagle had been repainted twice in the 20 years since Hank had taken over the chapter, but the sign itself was original, bolted to the roof with brackets that had rusted into permanence. From the road, you could see it from half a mile away, even in the rain. Hank had turned 47 that spring. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled from experience rather than genetics. Deep lines around the mouth, a jaw that had been broken once, and healed slightly off-center eyes that were pale and steady and gave away nothing unless he chose to let them. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles, and he kept them still when he was thinking, which he was doing now. His leather vest bore the patches of 22 years with the Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club, the chapter he had built from 11 men in a rented garage into something that the valley respected or avoided, depending on who was doing the calculating. He was not by any standard measure a gentle man, but he was a fair one, and the men who rode with him understood the difference, which was why they stayed. He was thinking about birthdays. Today would have been Sharon's 28th, would have been because he didn't know if she was alive or dead and hadn't known for 11 years, and that particular not knowing had become a permanent resident in his chest, a weight he carried so constantly that he had stopped noticing it on most days. It sat beside the other things he carried, the guilt and the regret and the stubborn, irrational hope that refused to die no matter how many dead ends he followed. On days like today, he noticed. The front door opened. Every head in the room turned, not fast, not alarmed, but with the reflexive awareness of men who had spent years paying attention to doors. The rain came in first, a gust of cold air carrying the smell of wet asphalt and turning leaves. Then the girl. She was small. That was the first thing. Small enough that for a moment she looked like a mistake, like the door had opened on its own and the wind had blown something in that didn't belong. She stepped inside and let the door close behind her and stood in the entrance with water dripping from her jacket onto the floor. She was wearing a bright red rain jacket with a tear at the left pocket that had been carefully folded over to keep it from spreading. Her boots were cracked at the toes and left small, wet prints on the floorboards. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a high ponytail that had somehow survived the rain, tight and deliberate, the kind of ponytail that someone had done with care and intention. Under her eyes, the skin was shadowed with the particular darkness that comes not from one bad night, but from many. She looked at the room, not with the wide-eyed scanning of a frightened child, but with the measured assessment of someone who was looking for something specific and had already decided what she would do when she found it. She found it. She walked past the pool tables, past the men who had turned to look, past Jake at the bar, who had set his glass down without realizing it, and she crossed the room to Hank's booth with the straight-backed, deliberate stride of someone who had somewhere to be and had been getting there for a very long time. She stopped at his table. Hank looked up slowly. The girl stood in front of him, soaking wet, 10 years old at most, and she was looking at him with an expression that was far too composed for her age. It was the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times that the rehearsal had become a kind of armor. Around her neck on a thin silver chain hung a ring. Hank's chair scraped back. The sound was loud in the silent room. The ring was a plain silver band, small enough to fit a woman's finger but too large for the girl's, which was why it hung on the chain. On its face, a tiny cross had been etched with something sharp, not engraved professionally but carved by hand, and along one edge there was a scratch, a faint line that ran from the cross to the outer rim. He knew that scratch. He had put it there himself 20 years ago when he was filing the edges, moved at the kitchen table of its house that didn't exist anymore. He had given the ring to his sister the winter she turned 17, and she had put it on a chain and worn it every day, and the last time he had seen it was the night she walked out of his life, 11 years ago. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried. In a room that had gone completely still, everything carried. The girl looked at him steadily. She didn't blink. She didn't fidget. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and she answered like she had been waiting to say these words for a very long time. "From my mother," she said. "She told me you'd know what it means." The bar had gone so quiet that Hank could hear the rain on the roof, each drop a small percussion against the tin. He could hear Tyler's towel stop moving behind the counter. He could hear Jake's breathing change at the bar, a small intake that was more recognition than surprise. Hank looked at the ring, then at the girl, then at the ring again. The scratch was there right where he remembered it, running from the cross to the outer rim. He had spent 20 minutes trying to buff it out that night at the kitchen table before deciding it gave the ring character. Sharon had agreed. She had held it up to the lamp and turned it so the scratch caught the light and said it looked like a tiny road leading away from the cross, and he had laughed, and she had put it on the chain and clasped it behind her neck and said she would never take it off. He hadn't thought about that conversation in years. He was thinking about it now. "Sit down," he said. She sat across from him without hesitation. She didn't scoot to the far side of the booth or press herself against the wall or keep one hand near the edge of the table. She sat in the center of the bench and placed both hands flat on the table in front of her, the gesture of someone presenting herself for inspection. Hank studied her. A child who had spent time being afraid of adults learned not to move quickly around them. This one moved like she had already decided he wasn't a threat or had decided it didn't matter either way. Both possibilities told him something. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ella." "How old are you?" 10. "Your mother," he said carefully. "What's her name?" "Sharon," Elma said. "Sharon Mills." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Behind Hank, Jake set his glass down on the bar with a soft click. Connor on a stool near the door turned slightly. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Hank kept his voice even. He had spent decades learning to keep his voice even when everything behind it was moving. "Where is she?" Ella's hands moved from the table to her lap, the first small sign of something beneath the composure. "I don't know," she said. "She gave me the ring 2 weeks ago. She said if anything happened to her, I should find the bar with the eagle sign and show it to whoever was in charge." She paused. "She said you'd know what it meant." Outside, the drizzle had thickened. The early autumn dark was settling faster than usual, pressing against the windows like something with weight. The light coming through the glass was the gray-orange of late dusk, and the bar's interior had taken on the close amber quality of a room that was pulling in on itself against the weather. 2 weeks ago," Hank said. "Where have you been since then?" Something crossed Ella's face. Not emotion exactly, but the practiced blankness of someone who had learned not to let the wrong thing show at the wrong times. It was the expression of a child who understood at an age when no child should understand it, that certain answers required a particular kind of delivery. "A house," she said. "They said it was temporary." "Who said the people who run it?" She looked at her hands. "There are 6 of us there. Kids." She looked back up. "My brother Danny is still there." Jake set his glass down a second time, though it was already on the bar. It was the gesture of a man who needed to do something with his hands. Connor turned fully on his stool, now facing the room. Garrett at the far end had folded his newspaper and was watching with the careful attention of a man who knew when things were about to change. "How did you get here?" Hank asked. "Walked," Ella said. "I've been looking for the eagle sign for 3 days." 3 days. Hank absorbed that without letting it show on his face. A 10-year-old girl had been walking through the valley for 3 days in the rain, looking for a sign she'd been told about by a mother who had prepared her daughter for the possibility that she might disappear. He studied Ella more closely now. The dark circles under her eyes made sense. So did the careful way she held herself spine straight, shoulders back, conserving energy rather than projecting confidence. Her bright red jacket was damp through, and the careful fold at the torn pocket spoke of someone who maintained what she had because there was nothing to replace it with. Her cracked boots had left a trail of small wet marks from the door to his table, a dotted line that traced her path through the room like a map of determination. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Yes," she said. No embarrassment, no performance, just the fact. He turned toward the bar. "Tyler, get her something." Tyler moved to the kitchen without a word. He didn't ask what. He didn't need instructions. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that the nature of the evening had shifted, and his job was to respond to it, not question it. Ella watched Hank steadily. Then she said something that rearranged the room again. "You knew her," she said. Not a question. "She's my sister," he said. The words sat in the space between them. Ella absorbed them without visible reaction, and the absence of reaction told Hank more than any response would have. Sharon had prepared her for this, had told her daughter enough about the man she might find at the end of the eagle sign that the answer when it came didn't surprise her. "She said you hadn't spoken in a long time," Ella said carefully. "We hadn't," Hank said. "That was my fault." He said it simply without elaboration, but the simplicity carried the weight of everything underneath it. 11 years of fault, 11 years of a phone call he should have made, and a door he should have left open, and a sister he should have listened to instead of judging. "I told her she was making bad choices," he said. "She stopped returning my calls. By the time I tried again, the number was disconnected." He remembered that night, the winter Sharon turned 17. Their parents had been gone 2 years by then, killed in a wreck on the interstate, when a truck driver fell asleep and crossed the median, and Hank had been raising Sharon since she was 15. He was 25 already, deep into the club, already living the kind of life that didn't leave much room for the patience that a teenage girl required. He did his best, which wasn't good enough, and he knew it wasn't good enough, which made him angry, and the anger made him worse. Sharon had been running with people Hank didn't approve of, staying out late, coming home smelling like cigarettes and cheap liquor, making decisions that scared him because they reminded him of the decisions their father had made before the wreck. The argument in the kitchen of their parents' house had been building for months and finally broke through on a Tuesday night in February. He told her she was heading down a path that would destroy her. She told him he didn't get to decide what destroyed her. He told her that if she didn't straighten out, she was on her own. He had meant it as a warning. She had taken it as a verdict. She left that night with the ring on the chain and a duffel bag and didn't look back. He stood at the kitchen window and watched her walk down the driveway in the cold, and he didn't go after her because he believed with the particular stubbornness of a young man who had confused control with love that she would come back when she realized he was right. She didn't come back. And Hank had spent 11 years learning the difference between being right and being there. He had searched for her quietly at first, then desperately, then with the grinding persistence of a man who understood that the guilt was permanent, and the only thing he could do with it was keep looking. He had hired a private investigator. He had called shelters and hospitals and police departments in 3 states. He had followed leads that went nowhere and chased names that turned out to belong to other women in other cities living other lives. He never found her. And now her daughter was sitting across from him in a bar that smelled like rain and engine oil, wearing her ring on a chain, telling him that Sharon had prepared for the worst and sent her child to find the brother she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Ella looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, a judgment being formed and filed and put away for later use. "She never said anything bad about you," she said. Hank didn't answer that. He couldn't. "Do you know why she disappeared?" Ella asked. "Not yet," he said. "Tell me about the house first." She told him. She spoke quietly and without drama, in the flat, measured recitation of a child who had processed something so thoroughly that the emotion had been worn smooth by repetition. She told it like a report, organized and sequential, which told Hank that she had been rehearsing this too, not just the moment of arrival, but the information she needed to deliver once she got here. The house was on Granger Street at the end of the block, where the residential area gave way to the empty lots and overgrown fences of the valley's neglected edge. A man named Walter Pruitt ran it. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with a jaw thick enough to notice, and a way of standing in doorways that made the doorways feel smaller. There were always 2 or 3 other adults rotating through the house faces that changed every few weeks, people who came and went without explanation and whose names the children were never given. The kids slept 4 to a room. 2 rooms upstairs, the beds pushed close together with barely enough space to walk between them. The windows had locks that could only be opened from the outside. The bathroom was shared and the schedule was posted on the wall, and every deviation from the schedule was noted. Walter had rules: no phone calls, no visitors, nothing leaving the house without his knowledge. The front door had a deadbolt that required a key, and Walter kept the key. The back door had a padlock. The windows on the first floor had been painted shut so many times the paint had become a seal. Ella described the rules without emphasis, as if they were simply the conditions of a world she had lived in and was now reporting on. But the shape of the thing was clear. The locks, the schedules, the rotating adults, the isolation. This was not a home, it was a container. She told him about the food. Meals were at fixed times, and if you missed the window, you didn't eat until the next one. The portions were the same for every child, regardless of age or size, and there were never seconds. She told him about the silence after 9 o'clock, the absolute rule that no child was to be out of bed. No child was to speak, no child was to use the bathroom without permission. She told him about the room in the back of the house that was always locked, the one Walter went into and came out of with his phone and his binder, and the particular expression of a man who was conducting business. She told him about the other children. There was a girl named Bethany who was 7 and had stopped speaking 3 weeks after she arrived. There was a boy named Cole who was 11 and who had learned to make himself invisible to occupy so little space that the adults forgot he was there, which was exactly what he wanted. And there was Marcus. "Danny's 9, she said. "He does what he's told. That's how he gets by." She paused, and for the first time something flickered across her composed expression, a crack in the armor, thin and fast and gone before it could be named. But Walter's been paying more attention to him lately, asking him questions, taking him into the office alone. "That's why I left when I did." Hank's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did something that rearranged itself in a way that the men who knew him would have recognized. Jake, watching from the bar, shifted his weight. Connor by the door uncrossed his arms. Tyler came back from the kitchen with a bowl of soup and bread. He set it in front of Ella, then remained near the table rather than retreating to the bar, a quiet statement of where he stood literally and otherwise. Ella looked at the food for a moment. Then she picked up the spoon and began eating with the focused, measured steadiness of someone who had learned not to draw attention to how hungry they were. She didn't eat fast. She ate deliberately, taking each spoonful with the discipline of a child who had internalized the understanding that food was not guaranteed and should be consumed with attention and care. Hank stood and moved to the bar. Jake and Connor were already close, drawn in by the gravity of what was happening in the corner booth. "Granger Street," Hank said low. "You know it." "End of the valley," Jake said. He was a lean man with a beard that was going gray and hands that were never entirely still. "Old residential, 3 or 4 blocks past the railroad crossing. Dead end. I need eyes on it. Slow pass. Don't stop. Tell me what you see." Jake was already pulling on his jacket. He was through the door in under a minute, and the sound of his engine faded into the rain 30 seconds later. Connor leaned against the bar. He was younger than Jake, broader through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of a man who held his energy in reserve until it was needed. He had come to the club 5 years ago, quiet and competent, and had proven himself in the way that mattered most to men like Hank. Not through talk, but through presence, through being exactly where he was needed at the moment he was needed there. "How does she know you?" Connor asked. "She doesn't," Hank said. "Her mother is my sister." Connor was quiet for a moment. The weight of the statement settled over him the way it had settled over the room. "The one you've been looking for?" "Yeah." Connor didn't ask anything else. There wasn't anything else to ask. Everyone at the Ironside knew about Sharon. Not the details, not the full story of the argument and the departure and the 11 years of silence that followed, but the shape of it. The sister who had disappeared. The calls Hank had made to numbers that were disconnected. The quiet inquiries through channels that had led nowhere. The private investigator who had eventually returned Hank's money and told him the trail was cold. The way Hank looked at his phone, sometimes on certain evenings at a photograph in a folder he thought no one knew about. Hank went back to the table. Ella had finished most of the soup and was working through the bread with the same measured deliberation. She didn't look up right away. A child who trusted the food to still be there when she looked back down had decided at least provisionally that she was somewhere safe. "Does Walter know you're gone?" Hank asked. "Not yet," she said. "Curfew's at 9. It's not 9 yet." Hank glanced at the clock behind the bar. 7:42. Just over an hour before someone at that house started counting heads and found a number that didn't add up. "Finish eating," he said. "Then I have more questions." Ella looked at him with the same careful measuring expression she'd had since she walked through the door. Then she said something that made the room shift again. "You're going to help Danny," she said. Not a question. "I'm going to find out what's happening first," Hank said. "Then we move." She seemed to accept this. Not with the passive acceptance of a child who had no choice, but with the calculated patience of someone who understood that there were steps between intention and action and that the man in front of her was the kind who took them in order. She picked up her spoon and returned to the soup. Hank sat across from her and waited for Jake to come back. The bar had slowly returned to its own noise, but it was different now. Quieter in the way a room gets quiet when everyone is paying attention to something they're pretending not to. Two men near the pool table had stopped playing and were standing with their cues in their hands, looking at nothing. A man at the far end of the bar had turned his stool a few degrees toward the room. Garrett had abandoned his newspaper entirely and was sitting with his arms crossed, watching the front door with the patience of a man who had learned that the first piece of information was never the last. Ella finished the soup. She set the spoon down carefully and wrapped both hands around the bowl for the warmth, and the ring on the chain caught the bar light and held it small and silver against the red of her jacket. Tyler refilled her water glass without being asked and stepped back. Outside, the drizzle came down steadily through the early autumn dark, and somewhere on Granger Street, a 9-year-old boy didn't yet know his sister had found the eagle sign. Jake came back at 8:15. He didn't hurry through the door, which told Hank something before he spoke. A man who rides back fast brings bad news loud. A man who rides back slow brings bad news quiet, and quiet was almost worse. Hank met him near the entrance. Connor was already moving across the bar to join them. Ella was still in the corner booth, both hands around her water glass, watching from across the room, with the particular attention of a child who had learned to read adult faces for information she wasn't being given directly. Hank turned his back slightly to the booth, keeping his voice below the bar noise. "Talk," he said. Jake pulled off his gloves. His hands were wet from the rain, and he wiped them on his jeans before he spoke. "House at the end of Granger. Single story at the front, but there's an addition built onto the back that pushes the property deeper than the front suggests. Lights on in 2 rooms, curtains drawn on everything else. Older van in the driveway, no plates on the front. Second vehicle parked on the street, newer out-of-state plates." He paused. Side gate was open, light in the back of the property. "Somebody's moving around out there." "How many adults?" Connor asked. "Couldn't tell from the road, but the van's big enough for 4 or 5 people. And that second vehicle wasn't there by accident." Hank was quiet for a moment. A house running 6 kids, rotating adults, no phones, no visitors, a van with no front plates, an out-of-state vehicle, someone moving in the back after dark. Each fact was a piece, and the pieces were assembling themselves into a picture that made his jaw tighten. He had seen this shape before. Not exactly this, but the architecture of it. The way certain operations constructed themselves to look like one thing from the outside while being something entirely different from the inside. The legitimate facade. The locked doors. The children who were taught not to speak. The rotating personnel who never stayed long enough to develop the kind of attachment that might lead to conscience. He knew what this was. He had known since Ella mentioned the van and the boy who didn't come back. But knowing and confirming were different things, and confirming required eyes and evidence and the particular kind of patience that separated action from recklessness. "The front door," he asked. "Deadbolt like she said, but the back fence opens onto the alley. Gate wasn't locked from what I could see." Hank looked at the clock, 8:16, 44 minutes before curfew. He turned and walked back to Ella's booth. She was watching him as he approached chin-level, expression steady. She had stopped pretending to look at anything else. "The van at the house," he said, sitting down. "Does Walter use it to move kids?" Something shifted in her face. Not surprise. She had been waiting for this question, or one close to it. She had been waiting to see if he would arrive at the same conclusions she had already reached. "Sometimes," she said, "he calls it activities, field trips." She looked at the table. "Danny told me one of the older boys got taken on a field trip 3 weeks ago. He hasn't come back." Connor, standing a few feet behind Hank, went completely still. "Which boy?" Hank asked. "Marcus," Ella said. "He was 12. Hank kept his expression neutral. The effort it took was considerable. "Did Walter say where Marcus went?" "He said Marcus got placed with a family." She looked up, and her eyes were the eyes of a child who had already done the math and was now watching to see if the adults would arrive at the same answer. "But Marcus didn't have any bags when they left. I saw him get in the van from the upstairs window. He didn't have anything." The bar was very quiet now. Not the performative quiet of people trying to listen, but the natural quiet that falls when something real is being said and the room knows enough to stay out of its way. Hank looked at Jake. Jake looked at Connor. Something passed between the three of them that didn't need words, a shared understanding that the shape of this evening had just changed in a way that couldn't be unchanged. "Ella," Hank said, "is Danny's name on any paperwork at that house?" She thought for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly, the first childlike expression she had shown since walking through the door. "Walter has a binder," she said. "He keeps it in the office upstairs in the closet behind a stack of boxes. It has all our names in it, and next to some of the names there are dates." "What kind of dates?" "I don't know. I only saw it once." She paused. The pause was deliberate, the kind of pause a person uses when they're about to say the thing they've been working toward all along. But Danny's name had a date next to it. It was circled. When next week. The word hung in the air between them. Next week. A circled date beside a 9-year-old boy's name in a binder kept hidden in a closet in a house where children disappeared into vans without their belongings. Hank felt something shift inside his chest, the particular rearrangement of a man's priorities when the theoretical becomes immediate. The clock behind the bar read 8:21. Hank stood. He looked at Tyler, who had been standing near the booth since Jake came back close enough to hear, close enough to be counted. "Stay with her," he said. Tyler nodded once and pulled up a chair next to the booth, settling into it with the quiet solidity of a man who understood his assignment. Before Hank moved away, Ella spoke again. "You're going to ask how Walter didn't notice I was gone for 3 days," she said. Hank stopped. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and something fiercer, something that burned beneath the tiredness, like a coal that refused to go out. "I left notes on my pillow each morning," she said. "I wrote that I was sick and staying in bed. I pulled the blanket up so it looked like someone was under it. Walter doesn't come upstairs during the day unless he has a reason." She paused. He didn't have a reason. She said it with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone describing a system she had studied and exploited. She had learned Walter's patterns the way a prisoner learns a guard's schedule through observation and patience, and the careful accumulation of data points that added up to a map of vulnerability. "I left through the bathroom window on the second floor," she continued unprompted. "It's the only one without a lock on the outside. The drop is about 8 feet. I hung from the sill and let go. The first morning I walked north because that's the direction the van usually goes when it leaves. I thought the eagle sign would be on the main road. It wasn't. The second day I went east toward town. I asked a woman at a gas station if she knew a bar with an eagle sign. She didn't. The third day I went south along the valley and I saw it from the bridge." Hank looked at her for a moment. 10 years old, 3 days of careful planning before she even walked out the door. Notes on the pillow, a system for the blanket, a window without a lock, an 8-foot drop. 3 days of walking in 3 different directions. A question at a gas station. And all of it driven by a ring on a chain and a mother's instruction and the particular kind of love that manifests as preparation for the worst. "When did he last see you in person?" he asked. 4 days ago," she said. "He'll notice at curfew tonight. 9 o'clock, 8:23, 37 minutes. Ella reached into the pocket of her bright red rain jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out. Hank took it and unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, careful and precise, drawn with the kind of attention that suggested it had been copied from something she had memorized rather than sketched from imagination. Granger Street ran along the left side. The house was marked with an X. The back alley was drawn in detail with the fence line, the gate, and the distance to the neighboring properties measured in what looked like paces. The front of the house had windows marked and numbered. The van's parking spot was indicated with a small rectangle. The addition at the back was outlined in a different color, a separate pen suggesting she had added it at a different time, perhaps after a second observation. In the corner, written in careful block printing that leaned slightly to the right, were the words, "Danny's room is the second window on the left upstairs." Below that, in smaller letters, "The office is at the end of the hall. The binder is in the closet." Hank looked at the map for a long moment. The detail was extraordinary. Not just the layout of the house, but the thinking behind it. She had drawn this map for someone else to use. She had anticipated what they would need to know and provided it before they knew to ask. She had been a prisoner in that house, and she had used her captivity to gather intelligence. "You planned this," he said. "I planned everything I could," Ella said. "The rest I left to you." He folded the map carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his vest next to his phone and the photograph of a 17-year-old girl laughing on a porch that no longer existed. He stood and looked at Ella one more time. 10 years old, dark ponytail, bright red jacket with a carefully folded tear, cracked boots still damp from 3 days of walking in the rain. Sitting in the corner booth of the Ironside Bar and Grill at 8:25 in the evening, like she had decided this was exactly where she needed to be and had been right. "You did good getting here," he said. Ella didn't smile, but something in her shoulders released just slightly. The smallest possible easing of a tension that had been held for so long it had become structural. It was the movement of someone who had been carrying a weight she had never expected to set down and was now being told for the first time that she could. Just enough. Hank turned toward the door. He moved to the back of the bar where Garrett was already on his feet, broad-shouldered and deliberate, the oldest among them, and the one who knew the valley better than anyone. Garrett had been with the club longer than Hank had ridden these roads before most of the others had licenses, and he had the particular gravity of a man who had seen enough to know when something mattered and when it didn't. This mattered. Hank told him what he needed in 6 sentences. Garrett nodded after each one. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't offer opinions that hadn't been requested. He listened with the attention of a man who understood that the information he was receiving had a shelf life and the actions it required had a deadline. "Police," Garrett asked. "Call Deputy Nash," Hank said. "Tell him we have a welfare concern on Granger Street and we need eyes there within the hour. Don't tell him everything, just enough to move him." Garrett pulled out his phone. "Nash owes me from the Kellerman thing. He'll move. Tell him to move fast and tell him to come quiet. No lights, no sirens until I say otherwise." "Understood." Garrett stepped away, phone already to his ear, speaking low and fast with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he needed to say and to whom he needed to say it. Hank stood in the center of the bar and looked at his men. They were already moving. Not because he had given an order, but because they had been listening and watching and reading the room since Ella walked through the door, and they had arrived independently and together at the same conclusion. Jackets were being pulled on. Helmets were being lifted from hooks. Gloves were being flexed and zipped. The quiet, efficient motion of men who knew what they were doing and didn't need to perform it for anyone. There was no bravado, no raised voices, no dramatic pronouncements about what was about to happen. These were men who had lived long enough to understand that the most important things were done quietly and that the measure of a man was not what he said before he acted, but how he carried himself while acting. Hank walked back to Ella's booth one last time. She was sitting with Tyler, who had placed a fresh glass of water in front of her and was sitting quietly, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. Tyler understood, in the way that quiet men sometimes understand, that what this child needed was not comfort or reassurance or conversation, but the simple physical fact of someone being present without requiring anything in return. Ella looked at Hank when he approached, and beneath her steady expression there was something tightly coiled. A breath held for so long it had become its own kind of exhaustion. "We're going to the house," Hank said. He crouched down to her level, which he hadn't done before, and the gesture changed something between them. He was no longer looking down at her. He was looking at her directly, which was what she deserved. "You're staying here with Tyler. Danny doesn't know what's happening," she said. "He'll be scared if they figure out I'm gone before you get there." "We'll be there before they figure it out," Hank said. "That's why we're leaving now." Ella looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and touched the ring on the chain around her neck, a small instinctive gesture, the gesture of someone touching a talisman for reassurance. "Bring him back," she said. "I will," Hank said. He stood and turned toward the door. The men were ready. They filed out into the drizzle without speaking, the sound of their boots on the wet gravel mixing with the rain, and the distant sound of thunder that was too far away to matter, but close enough to hear. Hank was the last one out. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the bar. Ella was watching him from the booth, both hands around her water glass, the ring catching the light one more time. Then he stepped out into the rain and pulled the door closed behind him. The parking lot was full of motorcycles, and the men who rode them standing in the drizzle with the patient, settled energy of people who had done this before in one form or another. Not this exactly, but the shape of it, the mobilization, the purpose, the particular clarity that comes when the question of what to do has been answered, and the only thing left is the doing. Engines came to life across the parking lot, one after another, a low, steady sound that built and held patient and certain, the sound of something that had been still and was now moving and would not stop until it reached where it needed to go. Hank swung onto his bike and pulled Ella's map from his vest pocket one more time, unfolding it against the tank and reading it in the amber glow of the bar sign. Danny's room is the second window on the left upstairs. The careful block printing of a 10-year-old girl who had thought of everything she could and left the rest to a man she had never met. He folded the map and put it away and pulled on his helmet and looked at the dark road ahead. The column formed behind him. Connor on his right, Jake directly behind back from his reconnaissance and ready. Garrett at the rear with his phone still warm from the call to Nash. The others spread between them, 12 bikes in all their headlights cutting through the drizzle in parallel lines that stretched toward the darkness at the end of the valley. Hank pulled out of the parking lot and the column followed, and the bar sign receded behind them. Its painted eagle glowing orange in the rain, its wings spread wide over the empty lot, and the closed door and the girl inside, who was sitting in a corner booth with her hands around a glass of water, waiting for the sound of motorcycles to fade into the distance, so she could finally stop being brave long enough to breathe. They rode without headlights, engines low throttled back to a rumble that blended with the rain and the wind in the bare autumn trees. Hank led the column down the valley road with the discipline of a man who had done this kind of thing before, not the rescue of children, but the movement toward a point where something had to be done, and the doing of it could not be delayed. The road followed the river. The water was black and swollen from the rain, moving fast and silent on their left, and the trees on both sides pressed close enough that their branches scraped the air above the riders' heads. The valley narrowed as they rode deeper, the hills rising on both sides like walls, and the houses became fewer and farther between, until the road was running through empty stretches of dark where the only light was the distant glow of a farmhouse window or the green reflection of animal eyes caught in the periphery and gone. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said or understood. Each man in the column carried his own version of what was happening, his own calculation of what they would find at the end of Granger Street and what they would do when they found it. Some of them had children, some of them had sisters. All of them had the particular kind of anger that comes from understanding that somewhere very close someone had been doing something to children that could not be allowed to continue. The rain came down steadily. Hank felt it against his face and his hands and the exposed skin at his wrists, where his gloves didn't quite meet his sleeves. It was cold, the kind of cold that October brings to the valley when the sun goes down and the air settles into the low places and the warmth of the day becomes a memory that no one trusts to return. Granger Street appeared on their right, a narrow road that branched off the valley highway and ran straight for 4 blocks before dead-ending at a chain-link fence and the empty lot beyond it. The streetlights were sparse, one at each end, and nothing in between, and the houses along the road were the kind that had been built 50 years ago for families that had since moved away, leaving behind structures that were maintained just enough to keep standing and not enough to keep welcoming. The house at the end of Granger Street sat in its own particular darkness, the kind that comes from a building that has stopped trying to belong to its street and has settled into something private, enclosed, and unwelcoming. Single story at the front with a flat roof that collected the rain in shallow pools, and an addition built onto the back that pushed the structure deeper into the property than the front suggested. The siding was a color that might have been green once, but had weathered to the gray of something that no longer cared what it looked like. Two windows showed light. Both had curtains drawn across them. Heavy curtains, the kind that weren't decorative but functional, designed to keep the inside from being seen from the outside. The rest of the windows were dark. The van was still in the driveway, an older model white with rust along the wheel wells and no plates on the front. The rear plates were covered with something tape or a dark cloth Hank couldn't tell from this distance. But the second vehicle was gone. The curb where Jake had seen it 2 hours ago was empty. Wet asphalt, a faint oil stain, and nothing else. Hank looked at Jake, who had pulled up beside him. Jake looked at the empty curb and shook his head once. It had been there, Tinin. Now it wasn't. Someone had left. Someone had been warned or had seen the reconnaissance pass earlier and decided not to stay. The out-of-state plates were gone, and whoever had been sitting in that fog sedan was now somewhere else carrying whatever they had come here to carry away. Hank filed it. The missing car changed the calculation, but not the objective. Danny was still inside. The other children were still inside. Walter was still inside. And the car that had left would be found later because men who operate in the dark always leave traces, and Nash's people would follow those traces wherever they led. He sat on his idling bike and looked at the house for a long moment. The rain came down steadily across the roof and the driveway and the van's windshield, and the curtained windows held their light without offering anything behind it. The house looked like a face with its eyes closed, a deliberate blindness, a refusal to be seen. 8:41, 19 minutes before curfew. He looked at Connor. Connor looked at the van, then at the sedan's empty spot, then back at Hank. A conversation conducted in glances. Hank cut his engine. One by one down the column engines died until the street was completely silent, and the only sound was the rain moving through the branches of the bare trees overhead and the distant hollow sound of water running through a storm drain somewhere beneath the road. He swung off his bike and unfolded Ella's map against his thigh, reading it one more time in the darkness. The house, the gate, the alley, the windows marked and numbered. Danny's room second on the left upstairs, the office at the end of the hall, the binder in the closet. He folded it and put it back in his vest pocket and looked at his men. Connor, he said quietly. Alley, back gate. You wait there until I say. Connor was already moving cutting wide around the property without a word, disappearing into the dark at the side of the house, like he had been practicing this particular kind of disappearance for years. He moved without sound. The rain covered what little noise his boots made on the gravel. Jake, Hank said, front, stay visible. Jake positioned himself at the foot of the driveway, arms loose at his sides, facing the front door. He stood in the open, making no effort to conceal himself, because that was the point. He was the thing Walter would see first when the door opened, the visible fact of a presence that could not be ignored or explained away. Behind Jake, the other men spread across the street, and the property edges in the dark, patient and still. They didn't cluster. They didn't posture. They took positions the way experienced men take positions, finding the angles that gave them sight lines and options without blocking anyone else's. Their presence was a fact rather than a threat, which made it more effective than any threat could have been. Garrett appeared at Hank's shoulder. He had been on the phone since they arrived, his voice a low murmur beneath the rain. Nash is 8 minutes out, he said quietly. 2 units. Tell him to come dark, Hank said. No lights, no sirens until I call it. Garrett was already back on his phone. Hank walked to the front door. The porch was small, barely deep enough for one man to stand on, and the concrete was cracked and stained with something dark that might have been oil or might have been something else. A single light hung above the door, turned off. Hank stood in the darkness and knocked twice. Hard, deliberate, the knock of a man who expected the door to open. Silence. Then footsteps inside. Heavy, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who wasn't expecting trouble and therefore wasn't rushing to meet it. The sound of a man who felt safe in his own house, who believed that the locks and the curtains and the control he exercised over the people inside were enough to keep the world from arriving at his door. The world had arrived. The door opened 4 inches and stopped on a chain. A man's face appeared in the gap. 50s. Thick through the jaw, just as Ella had described. Wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were heavy and covered with dark hair. His eyes went to Hank, first registering the leather vest and the patches, then past him to Jake standing in the driveway, then to the shapes of men visible in the street behind Jake. "Help you," he said. "Walter," Hank said. The man's eyes came back to Hank's face. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration, the particular alertness of a man who was accustomed to controlling every variable in his environment and had just encountered one he hadn't anticipated. "Who's asking?" "My name's Hank," he said. "I'm here about the children in this house." Something else shifted, deeper this time. Not fear exactly, but the cousin of fear, the awareness that arrives when a man understands that the conversation he's having is not the conversation he was prepared for. "This is a licensed residential care facility," Walter said. His voice was measured, practiced. He had said this sentence before to other people at other doors. It was the sentence he kept ready, the first line of a script designed to end conversations before they started. "You have no business here." "I've got a 10-year-old girl at my bar who says different," Hank said. "And I've got questions about a 12-year-old named Marcus who got in your van 3 weeks ago and hasn't been seen since." The chain didn't move. Walter's eyes went to Jake again, then to the street. He was counting the shapes in the dark, trying to arrive at a number that made sense, trying to calculate whether the situation could still be managed. "You need to leave," Walter said, "or I'm calling the police." "Deputy Nash is already on his way," Hank said. "Should be here in about 6 minutes. So you can close that door and wait for him, or you can open it and we can talk about Danny before he gets here. That's the only choice you have tonight." He said it calmly, without threat, without heat. He said it the way a man says something that is simply true, a statement of conditions that have already been set and cannot be altered by anything Walter does or says or tries. He had learned over decades of standing in front of men who were trying to calculate their options that the most effective thing you could do was remove the illusion of options entirely. Walter's eyes moved one more time, a final sweep of the street, the bikes, the men in the dark. He was looking for an exit. There wasn't one. The alley behind the house had Connor in it. The street in front had 12 men and their motorcycles. The phone in his pocket would call the same deputy who was already on his way. Every door was closed except the one Hank was standing at, and the only direction it opened was inward. The door closed. The chain rattled. Then the door opened fully. Walter stepped back into the hallway. He was taller than Hank had expected, 6'1" or 6'2", and he carried his weight forward in his chest and shoulders, the build of a man who used his physical size as a tool of presence. The hallway behind him was narrow and smelled of institutional cleaning product, the harsh chemical scent of something designed to sterilize rather than freshen, and underneath it something else, the stale, closed-in smell of a space that had been sealed too long with too many people inside. Hank walked in. The front hall led to a staircase on the right and a common room at the far end. The common room was small, lit by a single overhead bulb that gave the space a flat, institutional quality. 2 kids were on a couch watching television with the sound turned low, a boy and a girl, both of them small, both of them sitting very still, the kind of still that isn't relaxation but vigilance. A third child sat at a small table near the window with a book open in front of him that he wasn't reading. His eyes were moving but not across the page. They were watching the hallway. All 3 looked up when Hank entered. None of them moved, none of them spoke. They looked at him with the careful assessing eyes of children who had learned to evaluate every new presence as either threat or irrelevance, and who had learned that the evaluation had to happen fast because the wrong conclusion could cost them. Hank kept his eyes on Walter. "Where's Danny?" he asked. "Upstairs," Walter said. "In bed, where all the kids are supposed to be at this hour." He said it with the particular emphasis of a man who was still trying to maintain the fiction that this house operated according to rules and standards and legitimacy, that he was a caretaker, that the children were in his charge by right and process. "Get him," Hank said. "You don't have the authority to get him," Hank said again, quietly, the same way he'd said everything else tonight. without raising his voice, without changing his tone, without adding anything to the words that wasn't already in them. Walter looked at him for a long moment. He was making a calculation, running the numbers on resistance versus compliance, trying to determine which path led to an outcome he could still control. He looked at the front door still open behind Hank, at Jake standing in the driveway at the Shapes Beyond. Then he turned to the staircase and called up, "Danny, come down." Silence. Then footsteps on the floor above. Small footsteps, careful and slow. The footsteps of a child who had learned that being called downstairs at night was not always a neutral thing. It could mean a meal. It could mean a question. It could mean something worse. And the only way to prepare for all possibilities was to move carefully and arrive ready for any of them. A boy appeared at the top of the stairs, 9 years old. Dark hair that needed cutting falling across his forehead in a way that suggested it had been pushed aside so many times it no longer stayed. He was wearing a t-shirt that was 2 sizes too large, the collar stretched and the hem hanging to his thighs, and socks with a hole in the left toe. He looked small at the top of the stairs, smaller than 9 should look, the diminishment of a child who had learned to take up less space than he was entitled to. He looked at Walter first, then at Hank. His eyes went to Hank's vest, to the patches, and something happened in his face that was complicated and immediate. Recognition without understanding. He didn't know what the patches meant, but he knew they meant something, and the fact that they meant something different from everything else in this house was enough to make him look at Hank again with an expression that was cautious and searching, and beneath everything else, desperately hopeful. "Your sister sent me," Hank said. Danny's face did something that was hard to watch. The rapid sequence of a child trying to process too many things at once. Relief and confusion, and the particular grief of someone who had been holding themselves together for a long time and suddenly didn't have to. His jaw worked. His eyes filled. He pressed his lips together hard and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they're trying to keep something inside from coming out. He came down the stairs one step at a time, watching Hank the whole way. Each step was deliberate. Each step was a small act of faith, a decision to trust that the bottom of the staircase led somewhere better than the top. His hand trailed along the banister, not gripping it, but touching it, maintaining contact with the only solid thing in a moment that felt like it might dissolve if he moved too fast. Behind him, the upstairs hallway was dark. The doors to the bedrooms were visible at the top of the stairs, closed, the paint around their handles worn to bare wood by years of small hands and mandatory schedules. The hallway light was off. Walter kept it off after 9 o'clock because darkness was another form of control, another way of making the space between the bedroom and the staircase feel longer and more dangerous than it was. When Danny reached the bottom, he stopped and stood very still. He was smaller up close. The t-shirt hung off his shoulders like a curtain, and his arms were thin, and his feet in their holed socks made him look younger than 9. He had his mother's eyes, Hank realized. The same dark brown, the same directness, the same way of looking at someone, as if the looking itself was a kind of conversation. "Is she okay?" he asked. His voice was smaller than Hank expected. The voice of a child who was afraid to ask the question because the answer might be the thing that finally broke him. "She's safe," Hank said. "She's been safe since this evening. She's waiting for you." Danny looked at the floor. He pressed his lips together again, and his jaw worked, and his hands curled into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in the effort of containing something that was too large for his body. Then he looked back up with eyes that were very bright and very steady. "She came back," he said, not a question, more like something he was saying out loud to make it real, the way a person speaks a prayer, not because they believe it will be answered, but because the speaking of it is the act of faith itself. "She never left," Hank said. "She just went ahead to get help." From outside, the sound of tires on wet asphalt, then another set. Nash arriving with his units quiet and dark as Hank had asked. Walter heard it too. His recalculation was complete now. Hank could see it in the way the man's shoulders settled, the particular stillness of someone who understood that the shape of the evening had changed irrevocably and that no amount of calculation would change it back. The script was over. The fiction of the licensed residential care facility was over. The chain on the door and the curtains on the windows and the locks that only he could open were all over. "The other kids," Hank said to Walter. "All of them, down here." Now, Walter called upstairs and three more children filed down ranging from 7 to 11, moving with the careful, measured steps of kids who had learned to read every situation before committing to it. A girl who was 7 and didn't speak. A boy who was 11 and had made himself so small and quiet that he seemed to occupy less physical space than his body actually required. A girl of about 10 who watched everything with eyes that were old beyond any reasonable measure. That made 6 in the room, counting Danny, and the 3 already in the common room. All of them did the same thing. They looked at Walter first, the reflex of captivity, the automatic checking of the authority figure's face for permission or warning. Then they looked at Hank. Then at the patches on his vest, as if the patches were a reference point they were using to orient themselves in a situation that had no other landmarks. Hank moved them all toward the common room away from Walter and positioned himself in the hallway between them. The children settled into the room with the practiced efficiency of people who were accustomed to being moved and arranged, but there was something different in their bodies now, a loosening, a slight relaxation of the vigilance that had been their default state. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel that the air in the house had changed. Nash came through the front door 2 minutes later. He was a tall man, lean, with the angular face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and the economical movements of a professional who had learned to read rooms the way mechanics read engines, by the sounds they made and the way the parts were arranged. He swept the room in one glance, the children, Walter, Hank, the hallway, the staircase, and nodded once. "Hank," he said. "Nash," Hank said. "Start with a binder in the office upstairs. Closet at the end of the hall behind boxes. Then ask him about a 12-year-old named Marcus in the van in the driveway." He paused. "And there's one more name, Sharon Mills. She's been missing 2 weeks. I think Walter knows why." Walter's jaw tightened. It was the only thing he did, but it was enough. A micro-expression that lasted less than a second, the involuntary contraction of a man who has just heard a name he was not expecting to hear, and whose reaction to it reveals everything the silence was supposed to hide. Nash saw it. His eyes moved to Walter with the expression of a man who had just been given a thread he intended to pull until the whole thing came apart. He nodded at the deputy behind him, a younger officer who moved toward the staircase without being told, because Nash's nod was all the instruction required. Hank stepped back and let Nash take the room. This part belonged to the law, and Hank understood the line between what he could do and what he should let others do. He had brought them here. He had opened the door. Now the door belonged to Nash. He walked out through the front door into the rain. The men were spread across the property, patient and still. They looked at him when he came out, 12 faces in the dark rain running off their helmets and their shoulders waiting. He gave one small nod. Across the driveway, shoulders dropped and breath was released. The exhale of men who had been holding themselves ready and could now let the tension go. Hank pulled out his phone and called the bar. Tyler picked up on the second ring. "Put her on, Engine," Hank said. A pause. Footsteps across the bar floor, Tyler's boots on the old hardwood. Then a transfer of the phone, a small shuffling sound, and then silence, the particular silence of a child who had picked up a phone and was holding it and not yet speaking because the moment was too large for speech. "It's Hank," he said. "Danny's safe. He's standing next to me right now. All 6 kids are accounted for. Nash is handling everything." The line was silent for a long moment. Not the silence of processing. The silence of a dam that had been holding for days and was now being told it could release, and the dam didn't know how. "All 6, Ella asked. Her voice was different now. Still steady, still controlled, but the control was costing her something visible, something she was spending like a currency she was about to run out of. "Nobody got left behind," Hank said. Another silence, smaller this time. The silence of someone adjusting to a reality they had hoped for but hadn't fully believed was possible. "Okay," she said. Her voice was still steady, only just, but steady. "One more thing," Hank said. "I gave Nash your mother's name. He's looking into it now." He paused. This was the part that mattered most. This was the promise he was making, not to the 10-year-old girl on the phone, but to the 11 years of failure that preceded this night. "We're going to find her, Ella." The line went completely silent. Not the silence of someone processing or adjusting or holding a dam. The silence of someone who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that the offer of help with it had momentarily taken away the ability to speak. The silence of a child who had done everything she could and had finally heard someone say the words she had been waiting to hear. "Okay," she said finally. The word came out smaller than everything else she'd said all evening. Just that one word and everything it was holding. "We're bringing Danny to you," Hank said. "Stay where you are." He ended the call and stood in the driveway in the rain and looked at the house. Through the front window, he could see Nash standing over Walter in the common room, notepad in hand, asking questions with the quiet insistence of a man who already knew the answers and was simply giving Walter the opportunity to provide them voluntarily before the opportunity expired. The deputy was coming back down the stairs with the binder in his hands, a thick three-ring binder with a dark cover, and even from outside, Hank could see the tabs and the labels and the organized precision of a system that had been designed to manage something that should never have been managed. A female officer from the second unit was in the common room, with the children talking to them in a low, steady voice crouching to their level, doing the work that needed to be done with the kind of people who knew how to do it. The children were listening. Some of them were beginning to look around the room with expressions that were slightly different from the vigilance they had worn before, expressions that were cautious but no longer closed, as if they were beginning to test the idea that the rules of this house might have changed. Nash came back outside 20 minutes later. His face had changed. The professional composure was still there, but beneath it was something harder, the particular expression of a lawman who has just seen something that has rearrange his understanding of what he's dealing with. He found Hank near the driveway. "The binder," Nash said. He kept his voice low. "It's not just names and dates, it's a ledger. Each child has a page. Entry date, physical description, medical notes, behavioral profile. And beside each name, there's a dollar amount." Hank didn't move. "The dates that are circled," Nash continued, "those are pickup dates. Scheduled transfers. Someone comes, someone pays, someone leaves with a child. The amounts vary. The younger ones are worth more." He paused. "Danny's page has next Thursday circled, $22,000 written beside it." The rain came down. Hank stood in it and let it fall on him and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be inadequate to the scale of what he was hearing. "Mark it," Hank said finally. "Marcus's page is marked completed," Nash said. 3 weeks ago, 18,000. There's a code next to it that I think corresponds to a buyer. We're going to need the task force to decode the full system, but the structure is clear. This isn't one man operating alone. This is a network." Nash looked at the house, then back at Hank. "There's something else," he said. The deputy found a bag in the back of the office closet behind the binder boxes. A woman's bag, brown leather worn at the straps. Inside, there's a wallet with an ID, Sharon Mills. Hank's hands curled at his sides. "Her phone was in the bag too," Nash said. "Smashed, screen cracked, battery removed. But the memory card is still in it." He reached into his jacket and held up a small evidence bag. Inside it, Hank could see the rectangular shape of a micro SD card. "My text says if this card is intact, whatever she photographed or recorded is still on it." "She found the binder," Hank said, not a question. "That's my read," Nash said. "She was inside this house somehow as a parent or a volunteer or God knows what, and she found the binder and she tried to document it. And Walter caught her." 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Nash nodded, "which means she's been missing since then, and Walter has had 2 weeks to move her, or—" He stopped himself. "We're going to find her, Hank. I've already called the regional unit. They're pulling Walter's property records, vehicle registrations, phone records, everything. If she's alive, we'll find her. If she's alive." The words sat in the air between them, cold and factual, and Hank let them sit there because acknowledging them was the only honest thing to do. "There was something else in the bag," Nash said. He reached into his jacket again and produced a second evidence bag. Inside it was a folded piece of paper, creased and worn at the edges, the kind of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times. "I can't let you touch it," Nash said, "but you should see it." He held the bag up to the light from the porch. Through the clear plastic, Hank could see handwriting. Sharon's handwriting, the same slanted, cramped script she'd had since she was a teenager, the letters pressing close together as if they were trying to keep warm. It was an address, a rural route number, and a road name he didn't recognize, followed by 2 words, Griggs property. "Mean anything to you?" Nash asked. "No," Hank said, "but it will." Nash looked at him for a moment, then nodded and put the evidence bags back in his jacket. I'll run it tonight. If there's a property under that name in the county, we'll have it by morning. Two more calls had already gone out. Nash's voice carrying through the open front door, the words Regional Task Force and Trafficking Unit, right reaching Hank's ears through the rain. It took another 40 minutes before Nash guided Walter out through the front door. Walter had straightened his flannel shirt. He had rolled his sleeves back down and buttoned them at the cuffs, the deliberate composure of a man trying to look like he was leaving on his own terms, trying to maintain the last shred of the fiction that he was a caretaker, a provider, a man who ran a licensed facility and was being inconvenienced by a misunderstanding. He stopped when he reached the porch and found Hank standing just outside it. He looked at Hank. Hank looked back at him. The rain fell between them. It was the only thing that moved. In the driveway, men stood beside their bikes, silent and patient. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply stood and looked at Walter with the particular attention of 12 men who had spent the evening learning exactly what he was and had arrived at a collective judgment that required no articulation. Walter looked at all of it, the bikes, the men, the rain, the night that had come apart around him in ways he had never prepared for because he had never believed it could happen. He had believed in the locks and the curtains and the rules. He had believed that the children would stay silent because they had always stayed silent, and that the fear he had cultivated would hold because fear had always held. He had not accounted for a 10-year-old girl with a ring on a chain and 3 days of planning and a map drawn in careful block printing. He had not accounted for the possibility that one of the children he had kept behind locked doors would turn out to be braver than every adult in his operation combined. He looked at Hank one more time. And in Walter's eyes, Hank saw the thing he had been looking for, the thing that confirmed what the binder and the dates and the dollar amounts had already proven. He saw the total absence of remorse, not guilt, not shame, not even the manufactured contrition of a man who knows he's been caught and is performing the expected emotion. Nothing. The flat, empty eyes of a man who had put prices next to children's names and circled the dates and never once considered that what he was doing required any justification at all. Then Walter looked at the ground and walked past Hank and didn't look up again. Nash guided him to the cruiser. The door closed. Nash looked back at Hank across the roof of the car and gave one nod, the nod of a man who understood what had happened here and who would make certain that the thing which had started tonight would be finished properly. The cruiser backed out, and its lights swept across the wet trees and the empty street, and the house that was no longer what it had pretended to be, and the lights faded down Granger Street until the dark swallowed them completely. Danny was standing in the front doorway. He had put on his shoes while Nash was finishing inside. Old sneakers, laces double-knotted the way a careful child ties them. The knots pulled tight and tucked because a child who has learned that nothing can be counted on makes certain that the things within his control are secured. He was wearing a jacket that was slightly too small, the sleeves ending an inch above his wrists, and he stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and watched the cruiser's lights disappear with an expression that was very still and very young. He was carrying the weight of a child who had been afraid for a long while and was only now beginning to understand that the fear had somewhere to go. "Ready," Hank said. Danny looked up at him. In the porch light that someone had turned on the boy's face was thin and pale, and his eyes were too large for it, the eyes of a child who had seen things he shouldn't have been required to see. "She's really okay?" he asked. "She's been asking about you all evening," Hank said. Danny nodded once. He stepped off the porch and walked to Hank's bike without being led with the directness of a child who had made a decision and was executing it without deliberation. Hank settled him on the seat in front of him, and the boy was so light that the bike barely registered the weight. They pulled out of Granger Street into the rain with the column forming behind them, engines' low headlights cutting through the drizzle, and the house receded in the dark behind them, growing smaller with every second until it was gone. And Danny kept his eyes on the road ahead the whole way. They pulled into the bar parking lot 20 minutes later. The rain had eased to a drizzle again, and the bar sign threw its pale orange light across the wet gravel, and the lot was quieter than when they had left. The bikes that had stayed behind were lined up along the far wall, and the windows of the Ironside glowed with the warm amber of a room that was occupied and waiting. Before Hank had his helmet off, the bar door opened. Ella came out. She stood on the step for 1 second, scanning the lot with the rapid, systematic attention of someone who had been watching that door for an hour, and had rehearsed this moment so many times that the rehearsal and the reality were colliding inside her. Then she saw Danny on Hank's bike, and she came down the step and crossed the gravel faster than walking, but not quite running, like she had spent all evening being exactly as composed as she needed to be, and was spending that composure, now all of it, on these last few feet. Danny was off the bike before it fully stopped. He crossed the remaining distance and walked straight into his sister, and Ella put both arms around him and held on. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them moved. They stood in the middle of the gravel lot in the drizzle, two children holding each other with the fierce total grip of people who had lost something and found it again, and were not going to let go until they were certain it was real. Danny's shoulders began to shake first, small tremors that worked through his thin frame and into Ella's arms, and she held him tighter and pressed her face against the top of his head, and her eyes were closed and her jaw was set, and she was doing what she had always done, absorbing his fear and holding it for him so he didn't have to hold it alone. Hank stood by his bike and looked at the tree line. Connor appeared at his shoulder. They stood there together without speaking for a while, two men watching, two children in the rain, and the silence between them held everything that words would have diminished. She planned 3 days of cover before she even left the house, Connor said finally low. Yeah, Hank said. 10 years old. Yeah, Connor was quiet. Then your sister taught her that. That kind of thinking. Hank didn't answer right away. He looked at the tree line, then at Ella and Danny still holding each other in the middle of the gravel lot, completely still, like the world could wait. Sharon always knew how to prepare for the worst, he said. I just didn't listen when she tried to tell me. After a while, Hank walked across the lot to where Ella and Danny stood. Danny had lifted his head from his sister's shoulder, but hadn't let go of her. Ella's arms were still around him, and her eyes were open now, looking at Hank as he approached with the expression of someone who was waiting for the next piece of information, the piece she had been waiting for all along. They found your mother's bag in the house, Hank said. He crouched down. He spoke carefully, choosing each word. Her phone was in it. It was broken, but there's a memory card inside that might have information on it. Ella's face didn't change, but her arms tightened around Danny. She didn't leave, Hank said. She was taken. She found something she shouldn't have, and Walter took her. I know, Ella said. Her voice was very small. I know she didn't leave. She would never leave us. There was an address in her bag, Hank said. A place outside the valley. Nash is running it down tonight. We're going to find her. Something happened then that Hank hadn't expected, not from this girl, not from this composed and armored and impossibly capable 10-year-old who had walked into his bar 3 hours ago with a plan and a map and a ring on a chain and the bearing of someone 3 times her age. Ella's composure broke. It didn't shatter. It didn't collapse dramatically. It came apart the way a structure comes apart when the last piece that was holding it together is removed. Her face changed first, the careful blankness dissolving into something raw and young and terrified. Her eyes filled. Her chin trembled. Her hands, still gripping the back of Danny's jacket, began to shake. She didn't make a sound. That was the part that broke Hank. She cried without making a sound, the tears running down her face and mixing with the drizzle, and she held onto her brother and shook and said nothing because she had spent so long being strong that she didn't know how to be anything else, even now, even when the strength was no longer required. Danny looked up at her with an expression of pure alarm. He had never seen his sister cry. She was the one who didn't cry. She was the one who told him it would be okay and made plans and kept her voice steady when everything else was shaking. She was the foundation, and the foundation was trembling, and he didn't know what to do. So he did the only thing he could. He held on to her tighter. Hank stayed crouched in the gravel in the rain, and he didn't move, and he didn't speak, and he didn't try to fix it or comfort it or explain it away. He let it happen. He let the 10-year-old girl who had saved her brother cry in a parking lot in the rain because she had earned it and because the crying was as necessary as everything else she had done tonight. After a while, Ella's shaking slowed. Her breathing steadied. She opened her eyes and looked at Hank over Danny's head, and her face was wet and her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked for the first time all evening exactly her age. You're going to find her, she said. Not a question, a statement, a declaration. The same way she had said everything else tonight, with the absolute certainty of someone who had decided what was true and was daring the world to prove her wrong. Yes, Hank said. She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a rough practical gesture, and she straightened her shoulders and she took a breath, and Hank watched the armor reassemble itself in real time, watched the 10-year-old girl put herself back together piece by piece, because there was still work to be done and she was not finished. Okay, she said, then we'll be here when you do. Hank stood. He looked at Tyler, who was standing in the doorway of the bar. Take them inside, he said. Feed them. Keep them together. Tyler nodded and came down the steps. He put one hand on Danny's shoulder, light and brief, and guided them both toward the door. Ella walked with her arm around her brother, and Danny walked pressed against her side, and they went into the Ironside, and the door closed behind them, and the warm light from inside spilled out for a moment and then was gone. Hank stood in the parking lot and looked at the sky. The clouds were low and fast-moving east across the valley, and the rain was thinning to a mist that hung in the air rather than falling through it. Somewhere out there beyond the valley and the highway and the county line, there was an address on a piece of paper in an evidence bag, and at the end of that address, there might be his sister. 11 years. 2 weeks. One night. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photograph one more time. Sharon at 17 laughing on a porch that no longer existed, wearing a silver ring on a chain. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed it and put the phone away and started his engine. The night was not over. The call came at 6:14 in the morning. Hank hadn't slept. He had sat at the bar in the empty Ironside with a cup of coffee that went cold, and another that replaced it, and a third that he forgot about entirely. His phone lay face up on the counter. It screened dark, and he watched it the way a man watches a horizon when he's waiting for a ship he isn't sure is coming. The bar was dark except for the light above the counter and the pale blue of the television playing with the sound off, and the faint glow of the exit sign near the back hallway, which cast a red wash across the floor that made the empty room look like it was holding its breath. He had replayed the evening in his mind. Ella at the door, the ring on the chain, the soup, the map, the ride through the rain, Danny on the stairs, Walter's flat, empty eyes, the phone call where Ella's voice had finally broken. He had replayed it all, looking for the thing he had missed, the detail he should have caught, the question he should have asked. He didn't find one. Ella had been thorough. She had given him everything she had, and everything she had was more than any 10-year-old should have needed to carry. Tyler had gone home at 2. Garrett had stayed until 4, sitting across from Hank in companionable silence, not speaking, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Before he left, Garrett had put a hand on Hank's shoulder and held it there for a moment, which was more than Garrett usually offered, and exactly enough. Connor had taken Ella and Danny to his house where his wife, a woman named Ruth, who had the particular competence of someone who had raised 3 children and buried one, had made up the spare bedroom without being asked and had settled the 2 children into it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that what they needed was warmth and proximity and the simple physical fact of clean sheets and a door that didn't lock from the outside. Ella hadn't wanted to go. She had stood in the bar at midnight with her brother asleep in the booth behind her and looked at Hank with the expression of someone who was being asked to step back from something she had started and was not ready to relinquish. I should be here when you find something, she had said. You should be sleeping, Hank had said. I've been sleeping 3 hours a night for 2 weeks. Then you need more than 3. She had looked at him for a long moment, and in that look was something that went beyond the composure and the planning and the armor. It was the look of a child who wanted more than anything to be treated as a partner rather than a dependent, who had earned by every measure that mattered the right to be in the room when the decisions were being made. I'll call you, Hank had said, the moment I know anything. I promise. She had nodded once. Then she had woken Danny gently, carefully, the way a person moves something fragile, and she had walked out with Connor and Ruth and her brother, and the door had closed behind her, and the bar had gone very quiet. Now it was 6:14 and Nash's name was on the phone. Hank, Nash said, the address checks out. Hank set down the cold coffee. Property on rural Route 12, about 40 miles north, Nash said. Registered to a man named Fletcher Griggs, retired law enforcement. Used to be an investigator with the county sheriff's office. Retired 8 years ago. The property is listed as a farm, but satellite imagery shows the main house, 2 outbuildings, in a structure at the back of the property that doesn't match any building permit on file. Griggs, Hank said. He didn't recognize the name, but the shape of it made sense. A retired investigator. A man who knew how the system worked because he had been part of it. A man who understood procedures and evidence and the particular vulnerabilities of institutions designed to protect children because he had spent a career working within those institutions and had learned exactly where the cracks were and how to exploit them. The memory card from Sharon's phone, Nash continued. My tech pulled the files at 4 this morning. There are photographs. The binder pages close-ups, names and dates and amounts. And there are 2 photographs of a vehicle, a black pickup truck with the plates visible. The plates come back to Fletcher Griggs. Hank was already standing. There's more, Nash said. Walter's phone records came in an hour ago. In the 2 weeks since Sharon disappeared, Walter made 17 calls to a number registered to a prepaid phone purchased in the county where Griggs lives. And Griggs's property tax records show a second structure on the land that was built 3 years ago without permits. No windows, single entry point, steel door. A building with no windows, a steel door, built without permits on the property of a retired law enforcement officer who had 17 phone calls from a man who sold children. I'm sending units, Nash said. Task force is mobilizing. But Hank, this is federal now. The moment we cross the county line, this belongs to the FBI. I've already made the call. How long? Hank asked. 2 hours to assemble and brief. Maybe 3, they want to do it right. 2 hours, Hank said. I know, Nash said. I know what you're thinking, but if she's been there for 2 weeks, 2 more hours won't change the outcome, and going in wrong could. Hank closed his eyes. 2 hours. 2 hours while his sister sat in a building with no windows and a steel door 40 miles away, waiting for something that might not come. 2 hours of a phone he couldn't call, and a door he couldn't open, and a distance he couldn't close. Hank, Nash said, I need you to let us do this. I'll be there, Hank said. I know you will, but you'll be there as an observer, not a participant. My people lead, your people stay back. That's the deal. That's the deal, boss, Hank said. He hung up and stood in the empty bar for a moment. Then he called Connor. Wake them up, he said. We're moving in 2 hours. The convoy left the Ironside at 8:30. Hank rode at the front with Connor and Jake flanking him. Behind them, 6 more bikes, the men who had been at Granger Street the night before, the men who had stood in the rain and watched Walter walk to the cruiser and who had carried Danny home on the back of Hank's motorcycle. They rode in formation, tight and disciplined, north along the Valley Highway, with the morning fog still clinging to the low places and the autumn sun cutting through it in pale shafts that moved across the road like searchlights. The valley opened as they rode north. The hills pulled back from the road, and the farmland spread out on both sides brown and gold, with the remnants of harvest in the trees along the fence lines were turning the deep red and orange of late October. It was beautiful country. It was the kind of country that made you believe nothing terrible could happen in it, which was exactly why terrible things did. Hank rode and thought about Sharon. He thought about her at 17 standing on the porch in the photograph. He thought about her at 19 walking down the driveway in the cold with a duffel bag and a ring on a chain. He thought about her at 28 somewhere in a building with no windows waiting. He thought about all the years in between, the years where she had been alive and struggling and raising 2 children alone and trying to do something brave and failing and not calling him because he had taught her with one sentence on one night that calling him was not an option. He was going to change that. He was going to spend whatever time he had left making certain that calling him was always an option for Sharon and for Ella and for Danny and for anyone else who needed it. He was going to be the man who answered the phone. Ella had insisted on coming. She was in Garrett's truck behind the motorcycle sitting in the passenger seat with Danny beside her. Hank had refused. He had looked at her and said no firmly, the way you say no to a child when the answer is final. Ella had looked at him with the same expression she had used in the bar the night before, the expression that was not defiance but certainty, the unshakable conviction of someone who had been fighting for her family since before anyone else noticed it needed fighting for. She's my mother, Ella had said. I found you. I drew the map. I started this. I'm going to be there when it ends. Hank had looked at Connor. Connor had looked at the ground, which was Connor's way of saying he agreed with Ella, but was too smart to say it out loud. Ruth had said nothing, which in itself was a statement. You stay in the truck, Hank had said. You don't get out until I come get you, no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear. Okay, Ella had said, and the word coming from her had the weight of a contract. She had proven over and over that her word was good. She had said she would find the eagle sign, and she had. She had said Danny was in danger, and he was. She had said she planned everything she could, and she had. When Ella said okay, it meant okay. They met Nash at a gas station 3 miles from the property. 2 county cruisers, an unmarked federal vehicle, and a van with tinted windows that carried the task force team. Nash was standing by the federal vehicle talking to a woman in a dark jacket who listened more than she spoke, which told Hank she was the one in charge. Nash made the introductions. The woman's name was Agent Winters. She was small and precise and had the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had done this many times and had learned that the quality of preparation determined the quality of outcomes. We go in at 9:45, Winters said. Federal warrant is signed. 2 entry points, front and rear. My team takes the structure at the back. Nash's people clear the main house and the outbuildings. She looked at Hank. Your people stay at the perimeter, no exceptions. Understood, Hank said. If there are occupants in the rear structure, we extract first to ask questions later. Medical is staged at the road. She didn't say what kind of condition the occupants might be in. She didn't need to. Everyone at that gas station understood the possibilities, and the possibilities were arranged in a spectrum from bad to worse, and the distance between them was measured in days and weeks, and the particular cruelty of a man who had built a prison on his own land. They moved to the property at 9:30. The Griggs farm sat at the end of a dirt road that branched off the rural route and climbed a low hill before leveling into a flat clearing surrounded by pine trees. The main house was a 2-story frame structure, well-maintained with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and a flag hanging from a bracket near the front door. It looked respectable. It looked like the home of a man who had served his community and retired to a life of quiet self-sufficiency. The landscaping was neat. The driveway was gravel-raked smooth. A black pickup truck was parked beside the house, and even from the perimeter, Hank could see the plates that matched the photographs on Sharon's memory card. Behind the house, past a barn that had been converted into a garage, a second structure sat at the edge of the tree line. It was smaller than the house, roughly the size of a 2-car garage built from cinder block with a flat metal roof. No windows, a single steel door facing the barn. A gravel path connected it to the main house. The building looked like a storage shed. It was designed to look like a storage shed. And the design was the point, because the most effective kind of prison is one that doesn't look like a prison from the outside. Hank stood at the perimeter with his men and watched the task force move into position. Connor was beside him. Jake was 10 feet to the right, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes on the rear structure. Behind them, Garrett's truck was parked on the road with the engine off, and in the passenger seat, Ella was watching through the windshield with her hands in her lap and her brother pressed against her side. 9:45. Winters gave the signal. A hand raised and dropped. Her team moved on the rear structure while Nash's deputies approached the main house. The movements were synchronized and practiced the choreography of professionals who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine everything. They moved across the clearing in a spread formation, low and fast, their boots leaving prints in the morning dew. The steel door required a ram. It took 2 strikes. The first dented the frame and buckled the lock mechanism. The second sent the door swinging inward with a sound that was part metal and part finality, the sound of a barrier that had stood for years and would never stand again. The team was inside before the echo-faded flashlights cutting through whatever darkness the doorway held. From the main house, voices, Nash's deputies announcing themselves, the practiced call of law enforcement entering a residence with a warrant. A man's voice deeper, responding with the measured composure of someone who was not surprised to have law enforcement at his door and was already constructing the narrative he intended to present. Hank could hear it even from the perimeter, the carefully modulated tone of a man who had spent decades on the right side of badges and believed with the institutional confidence of a former investigator that the badges would extend him courtesy, that he would be treated as a colleague rather than a suspect, that the systems he had spent 30 years inside would protect him now that he needed protecting. He was wrong about that. Then from the rear structure, a voice on the radio, Winters's voice, taut and professional, stripped of everything except the information it needed to carry. Two words that changed everything. "We've got them." Hank's hands curled at his sides. "Three occupants," Winters continued. "Two minors, one adult female, all alive. Medical to the rear structure now. All alive." Hank took one step forward. Connor's hand landed on his shoulder. Not restraining, just present. A reminder of the deal. A reminder that the next few minutes belonged to the professionals, and that Hank's job was to stay at the perimeter and let them work. He stayed. It was the hardest thing he had done all night, harder than knocking on Walter's door, harder than listening to Ella's story, harder than standing in the rain while Nash guided a man who sold children into the back of a cruiser. He stayed at the perimeter and watched the paramedics move across the clearing toward the rear structure, and he waited. The two children came out first. A boy and a girl, both young, both blinking in the morning light, with the stunned, disoriented expression of people who had been in a dark space for a long time and had forgotten what the sun looked like. They were wrapped in blankets by the paramedics and guided toward the road. And as they passed the perimeter, the boy looked at Hank with eyes that were vacant and distant, and Hank looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing in any language that was adequate to what those eyes contained. Marcus. The boy was Marcus. 12 years old, thinner than any 12-year-old should be, with the particular pallor of someone who had not seen daylight in weeks. His hair was matted, and his clothes were the same clothes he had been wearing 3 weeks ago when he got into Walter's van without any bags, because he hadn't been given any bags, because the people who put him in the van had never intended for him to need them again. He walked with the careful, measured steps of a child who had forgotten how to move in open space and was relearning it in real time, each step a negotiation between the body's memory of freedom and the mind's conditioning to confinement. The girl beside him was younger, maybe 8, with tangled blonde hair and a face that was expressionless in the way that faces become expressionless when expression has become dangerous. She held Marcus's hand and didn't let go, and she didn't look at anyone, and she walked where the paramedics guided. Her and the blanket around her shoulders was the first warm thing she had been given in a long time. Hank watched them pass. He didn't look away. Looking away would have been a form of cowardice, a refusal to bear witness to the thing he had helped uncover. He owed these children the respect of seeing them. Then Sharon came out. She was between two paramedics, one on each side, and she was walking under her own power, which was the first thing Hank noticed, and the thing that allowed him to breathe. She was walking, she was upright, she was thinner than the photograph. Thinner than the 17-year-old girl laughing on the porch, thinner than any version of her he had carried in his memory for 11 years. Her hair was darker than he remembered, or maybe it was the light, or maybe it was the shadows under her eyes that made everything look darker. She was wearing clothes that were not hers, a gray sweatshirt and pants that were too large, and her feet were bare, and her wrists had marks on them that Hank could see even from 50 feet away. She squinted in the light. She raised one hand to shade her eyes, and the gesture was slow, the movement of someone whose body had been still for a long time and was remembering how to do things it used to do without thinking. She looked across the clearing, past the paramedics, past the task force members, past the cruisers and the trucks and the men at the perimeter. She found Hank. For a moment, neither of them moved. 28 years old and 47 years old, and 11 years of silence between them, standing 60 feet apart in a clearing on a hill on a morning in October, and the distance between them was not measured in feet, but in every phone call that was never made, and every door that was never opened, and every year that passed without the single simple act of saying, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and please come home." Sharon's face crumpled. It was the same face, older, thinner, marked by things he couldn't yet name, but the same face, the same eyes. The same way her mouth turned down when she was trying not to cry, which she had done at their parents' funeral and at the kitchen table the night she left, and which she was doing now, standing in the morning light outside a building with no windows, looking at the brother who had let her go. Hank broke the perimeter. He walked across the clearing, not fast, not slow. He walked with the deliberate, steady pace of a man who was going to reach the person in front of him, and nothing was going to stop him. Connor didn't try. Nobody tried. The deal was broken, and nobody cared. He reached Sharon and stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The paramedics stepped back without being asked, because some things are more important than protocols, and every person in that clearing understood what they were watching. "I'm sorry," Hank said. 2 words. 11 years late. Inadequate to everything they were supposed to carry, but he said them because they were true, and because he had been rehearsing them for 11 years, and because she deserved to hear them even if they weren't enough. Sharon's hands came up and gripped the front of his vest, and she pulled herself into him, and he put his arms around her and held on. She was shaking. Small tremors that he could feel through the leather, the trembling of a body that had been cold and afraid and alone for too long, and was only now beginning to understand that it didn't have to be any of those things anymore. "You came," she said into his chest. Her voice was muffled and broken, and it was the most important sound he had ever heard. "Ella found me," he said, and she walked into my bar with your ring on a chain and a map in her pocket, and she told me everything. Sharon made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. She said. "She's like you." "She's like you," Hank said. Sharon pulled back. Her face was wet. She looked at him with an expression that held everything, the anger and the forgiveness and the grief and the relief, all of it layered and tangled and inseparable, the way it is between people who have loved each other badly and are trying to figure out what it looks like to love each other well. "I knew about the binder," she said. Her voice was raw, the voice of someone who had been breathing stale air for 2 weeks and was still adjusting to the open sky. "I found it 6 months ago. I was volunteering at the house doing laundry cleaning. Walter brought me in because he needed someone cheap and someone who wouldn't ask questions. He thought I was too broken to pay attention." She looked at Hank with an expression that held the ghost of defiance. "I wasn't too broken," she said. "I paid attention to everything. I saw the kids come and go. I saw the van leave at night and come back empty. I saw the dates on the calendar and the phone calls Walter took in the back room with the door locked. And one day when he left the office unlocked for 10 minutes, I found the binder." She paused. She was breathing harder now, the effort of telling this story pulling against the exhaustion in her body. "I photographed every page," she said. "I used a prepaid phone I bought at a gas station. I was going to take it all to the police. I had a plan. I had a timeline. I was going to get the kids out and then go to the authorities and hand them everything." "What happened?" Hanks asked. "I found out who was behind it." She looked toward the main house where Nash's deputies were escorting a man in handcuffs through the front door. Fletcher Griggs, 62 years old, silver-haired, wearing a pressed flannel shirt and boots that were clean and expensive. He walked with the upright posture of a man who had spent decades carrying a badge and still moved as though he was wearing one. "He was a cop," Sharon said, "an investigator. He knew everyone in the county. He knew the judges, the social workers, the foster system coordinators. He had built this thing using every connection he had from 30 years in law enforcement. I couldn't go to the police because I didn't know which ones were his. I couldn't go to social services because he had people there too. Every door I thought about knocking on had his shadow behind it." She looked at Hank, and in her eyes was the thing that had kept them apart for 11 years, the thing that was more powerful than anger and more durable than silence. "And I couldn't come to you," she said quietly, "because the last time I needed help, you told me I was on my own." The words landed exactly where they were supposed to. Hank absorbed them without flinching, because flinching would have been a kind of evasion, and he owed her better than evasion. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything, about what I said that night, about letting you walk out, about every year I didn't find you, about thinking that being right was the same thing as being good." Sharon looked at him. The tears were still coming, but they were slower now, quieter. "You tried to find me," she said. "I know you tried. I moved so many times. New towns, new names, new jobs. I didn't want to be found." She looked at the ground. "I was ashamed, Hank. You told me I was making bad choices, and then I spent 10 years proving you right. Every city, every apartment, every job I lost, every relationship that fell apart. And the one time I tried to do something good, something that mattered to get those kids out of that house, I got caught. I got caught because I wasn't careful enough. And Walter found the phone and he called Griggs and they put me in that room." Her voice broke on the last word, room. The word that meant a cinder block box with no windows and a steel door and a single light bulb and 14 days of darkness and silence. And the particular kind of despair that comes from knowing that the people who are supposed to protect the vulnerable are the ones doing the harm. "You didn't get caught," Hank said. You got delayed. Your daughter finished what you started. Sharon looked at him. Something moved in her face, a rearrangement, the beginning of something that wasn't there before. Where is she? Sharon asked. Hank turned and looked toward the road. Garrett's truck was parked at the shoulder. The passenger door was open. Ella was standing beside it, violating the agreement they had made, because she was her mother's daughter, and she was not the kind of person who sat in a truck when her family was 60 feet away. Danny was beside her. He was holding her hand. Sharon saw them. She made a sound that had no name, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than language, deeper than the 2 weeks in the dark room, and the 6 months of investigation, and the 11 years of silence that preceded all of it. It was the sound of a mother seeing her children, and it carried across the clearing and reached Ella and Danny before Sharon's feet could. Ella moved first. She let go of Danny's hand and crossed the grass at a run, not the careful, composed walk she had used in the bar, not the measured stride of a girl who had learned to control every visible expression of what she felt. She ran, full speed, arms pumping her bright red jacket, a streak of color against the October morning, and she was 10 years old and running toward her mother, and the world was very simple for the length of time it took her to cross that distance. Danny followed, slower, smaller, his too large jacket flapping around him, and his double-knotted sneakers pounding the grass, running the way 9-year-old boys run with their whole bodies, every part of them committed to the forward motion. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know about the binder, or the phone card, or Fletcher Griggs, or the building with no windows. He knew only that his sister was running, and that the direction she was running was the right one because Ella's direction was always the right one. Sharon went to her knees. She opened her arms and caught Ella first, and the impact of it, the collision of a mother and a daughter who had been separated by violence and reunited by courage, made a sound that was not a sound, but a breath, a release, the exhalation of 2 weeks of terror and 3 days of searching and 11 years of silence, all leaving the body at once. Then Danny crashed into both of them, and the three of them collapsed into each other on the grass in the morning light. And Sharon was crying, and Ella was crying, and Danny was crying, and nobody in the clearing looked away, and nobody pretended not to see. Sharon held them. She held them the way you hold something that you thought was lost forever and has been returned to you, with a grip that is too tight and a desperation that has not yet learned to trust. Her hands moved across their backs and their shoulders, and their hair touching them, confirming them, making certain that they were real and solid and present, and not the dream she had been having in the dark room for 14 days. Ella pressed her face into her mother's neck and breathed. She breathed the way a person breathes when they surface after being underwater for too long, deep and ragged and grateful, and her hands gripped the gray sweatshirt and wouldn't let go. Danny was making a sound, small and repetitive, the sound of a child who is crying without knowing how to cry, because he has spent too long not being allowed to, and the sound was breaking open something in everyone who heard it. Hank stood 10 feet back and watched. Connor appeared beside him. Neither of them spoke. The morning light moved across the clearing as the fog burned off, warming the grass and the pine trees and the three figures on the ground who were holding each other with the fierce desperation of people who had been separated and found and were never going to let the separating happen again. After a long time, Sharon lifted her head. She looked at Hank over the heads of her children. Her face was wet and her eyes were swollen, and she was smiling the first real smile he had seen from her in 11 years, and it was the same smile from the photograph, the one where she was laughing at something outside the frame on a porch that no longer existed. "Thank you," she mouthed. Hank nodded. He couldn't speak. He didn't try. Griggs was loaded into a federal vehicle. His expression as he was guided into the back seat was the controlled, composed blankness of a man who was already constructing his defense, already separating himself from the evidence, already preparing the narrative of a misunderstanding. He had the bearing of a man who had sat on the other side of this process for 30 years and believed he understood it well enough to navigate it. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. He would learn. The binder was evidence. The memory card was evidence. The building with no windows was evidence. Marcus and the girl they had found with him were evidence. Sharon was evidence. The 17 phone calls between Walter and the prepaid number were evidence. The out-of-state vehicle that had fled Granger Street the night before would be found because men who operate in the dark always leave traces, and the people who were now tracing them had resources and patience. and the particular motivation that comes from having seen the inside of a cinder block building where children were kept. The system Griggs had built, the network of houses and rotating adults and vans without plates and children with circled dates beside their names, would be dismantled piece by piece, name by name, date by date, until every thread was followed to its end, and every end was documented, and every person who had participated in it was held to account. Nash crossed the clearing to Hank. He looked tired but satisfied with the expression of a man who had done difficult work and done it well, and understood that the work was far from over. "It's going to be a long process," Nash said. "Federal case, multiple jurisdictions. Walter will cooperate my read. Griggs won't. But the binder and the phone card are enough to start." "Marcus," Hank said. "He's being transported to the hospital. Malnourished and dehydrated, but responsive. The girl they found with him is younger, maybe 8. We don't have her identity yet. She hasn't spoken." Hank nodded. "Sharon needs medical attention too," Nash said. "The paramedics want to take her in for evaluation." "She'll go," Hank said, "but she goes with her kids." "Already arranged," Nash said. He looked at Hank for a moment. "You broke the perimeter," he said. "Yeah." "I would have too," Nash said. He extended his hand. Hank took it. They shook once firmly, and Nash walked back to his vehicle, and the clearing began to empty as the law enforcement personnel packed their equipment and the medical vehicles pulled out toward the highway. Hank walked back to where Sharon was sitting on the grass with Ella on one side and Danny on the other. The paramedics were hovering nearby, patient but insistent. Sharon looked up at Hank. "I have to go to the hospital," she said. "They want to check me out." "I know," Hank said. "I'll be there." "Hank," she said. Her voice was quiet and steady, and in it he could hear the girl she had been and the woman she had become and the mother she was, all layered together. "I didn't come to you because I thought you wouldn't help me. I came to you because I was afraid you would, and then you'd see what my life had become, and you'd look at me the way you looked at me that night in the kitchen." "I'm not looking at you that way," Hank said. "I know," she said. "Ella told me." She stood with help from Ella on one side and Hank on the other, and she walked toward the ambulance with her children beside her arm. At the door of the ambulance, she stopped and turned back. "The ring," she said. "Where is it?" "Ella has it," Hank said. Sharon looked at Ella. Ella reached into her jacket pocket, but the pocket was empty. She checked the other pocket. Empty. She reached up to her neck, but the chain wasn't there. "I left it," Ella said. She looked at Hank. "At the bar, last night, on the table." Sharon looked at Hank. Hank looked at Ella. Something passed between the three of them that was quiet and complicated and laden with a meaning that would take time to fully understand. "It's waiting for you," Ella said to Hank. "Mom gave it to me so I could find you. I found you. Now it's yours again." Hank looked at her for a long moment. 10 years old, bright red jacket, dark ponytail, the girl who had walked into his bar in the rain and changed everything. "We'll talk about the ring," he said, "after your mom gets checked out, after everyone's eaten, after we've all had some sleep." Ella nodded. She climbed into the ambulance after Danny and Sharon followed, and the doors closed, and the ambulance pulled out of the clearing and turned onto the rural route and headed south toward the hospital and the valley and the town where all of this had started. Hank stood in the clearing as the last of the vehicles departed. Connor was beside him. The morning sun was fully through the bog, now warming the clearing, and the pine trees cast long shadows across the grass where Sharon and her children had sat. "What now?" Connor asked. Hank looked at the rear structure. The steel door hung open on its broken hinges. Inside, he could see the bare walls and the narrow cot and the single light bulb that had been Sharon's world for 2 weeks. He looked at it for a long time. "Now we go home," he said, "and I pick up a ring." They rode back to the Ironside in the late morning light. The valley spread out below them in the reds and golds of Octobersea, the river glinting silver through the trees, the road unwinding ahead of them, like a promise that had taken 11 years to keep. The Ironside was empty when Hank walked in. The door was unlocked, which meant Tyler had been there already, and opened up. The bar smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner and the particular quiet of a room that was waiting for something. He walked to the corner booth. Ella's booth. The booth where she had sat with her hands around a water glass and told him everything and changed the shape of his life. The ring was on the table, small and silver. The cross etched into its face. The scratch running from the cross to the outer rim, the tiny imperfection he had made 20 years ago at a kitchen table in a house that no longer existed. He picked it up. It was warm from the bar light that had been falling on it all night, and it sat in his palm with the particular weight of something that had traveled a very long distance to come back to the place it started. He turned it in his fingers. The cross, the scratch, the faint scratch that Sharon had called a tiny road leading away from the cross. He had forgotten that detail until last night, and now he would never forget it again. He closed his hand around it and held it, and he stood in the empty bar in the morning light and felt the weight of it and everything it carried: the sister he had lost, and the niece who had found him, and the brother he had failed to be, and the second chance he had not earned but had been given anyway by a 10-year-old girl in a bright red jacket who had walked 3 days through the rain to bring it to him. He thought about what Sharon had said, that Ella was like him. He didn't agree. Ella was better than him. She was braver. She had done at 10 what he hadn't been able to do at 25, which was to set aside her fear and her pride and her anger and do the thing that needed to be done for the people who needed her to do it. She had walked into a stranger's bar and asked for help, which was the thing Hank had never been able to do and the thing Sharon had learned from his failure not to do. Ella had broken the pattern. She had looked at the wall that Hank had built between himself and his sister and had walked straight through it as if it wasn't there, because to her, it wasn't. It was just a wall, and walls are only permanent if you agree to let them be. He put the ring in his vest pocket next to his phone and the photograph. He would give it back to Sharon when she was ready. Not today. Today was for hospitals and paperwork and the beginning of a process that would take months to complete. But someday, when the wounds were less fresh and the fear was less immediate, and the three of them, Sharon and Ella and Danny, had built something that felt like stability, he would take the ring out and put it on the table between them and say, "This belongs to our family," and they would decide together what to do with it. He sat down in the corner booth and put his hands on the table and looked at the empty bar. The morning light came through the windows in long, warm stripes that fell across the tables and the floor and the pool table in the back where nobody was playing. The eagle sign outside cast a faint shadow through the glass, and the shadow moved slightly in the morning breeze, and the wings were spread wide, and the light moved through them and fell on the floor like something living. He would call the hospital in an hour. He would go there and sit in the waiting room and be present and available and patient, which were the three things he had not been 11 years ago and which he was going to practice being for the rest of his life. But for now, he sat in the corner booth of the Ironside Bar and Grill and waited for his family to come home. And the ring sat in his pocket, small and silver, and the scratch along its edge caught the light through the leather invisible. But there, a tiny road leading away from the cross and back again.